So this next video is not necessarily focusing on a skill. However, it is highlighting something that's really important that often comes up in families, and that is dialectical dilemmas. And so with dialectics, in dialectical behavior therapy, we talk about the synthesis of, two things that might seem like opposites, right? So that could be acceptance and change, having to accept our current circumstances while also working to change our future in order to move towards our life worth living goals. And so in DBT, we talk a lot about dialectics because dialectics are really important to recognize in relationships. And so before we get into dialectical dilemmas, we're going to talk a little bit about dialectics. So in review, because we have talked about this before, dialectics focus on the fact that opposites can exist. So these two things that seem like polar opposites can actually both be true or exist simultaneously. There's always more than one way to see a situation and more than one way to solve a problem. And so while we often do stay away from those words like always, there really is always, when we talk about dialectics, more than one way to see a situation and more than one way to solve a problem. In dialectics, we also focus on the fact that everything and every person is connected in some way, and thus our actions and our behaviors can impact one another. In dialectics, we focus on change is the only constant and change is transactional. So change is happening all the time, and it is important to recognize when that change is happening that we might also need to take part in that change. And so DBT focuses on three main dialectical dilemmas when it comes to family relationships. There are hundreds upon hundreds, maybe even endless amounts of other dialectics that can be looked at as dilemmas. However, when we talk about dialectics in families and dialectical dilemmas, there are three big ones that are really important to highlight. The first one is too loose versus too strict, and this happens all the time in families. Oftentimes we have one parent might play a role as the too loose parent, another parent might play the role of the too strict parent, and you can imagine, or you've experienced the kind of conflict that can create. On the other side of that, sometimes parents might be too strict, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And that can create conflict, such as your young one engaging in the behavior anyway, or your young one not coming to you when they do engage in maladaptive behaviors because they're fearful of how you might react. We also talk about making light of problem behaviors versus making too much of normal, typical adolescent behaviors. And spoiler alert, some of the behaviors that are happening right now are typical of adolescents or young adults, even if we don't like them. And lastly, the dialectical dilemma that we talk about is forcing independence versus fostering dependence. And so these three dialectics are really important to talk about in families because they can create a lot of conflict, and there's room for a lot of personal growth and growth within the relationships when we start to recognize these things and we start to talk about them. We're first going to talk about too loose versus too strict. So when we talk about these dialectical dilemmas, we want to find the middle path. Too loose can yield for ineffective behaviors and not learning from mistakes. Too strict can yield for secrets and continuing to engage in maladaptive behaviors, or people not coming to each other when they have done something that's ineffective or maladaptive. And so we want to find the middle path between these two. And so the middle path between too loose and too strict would be having clear rules and enforcing them consistently and being willing to negotiate on some issues. So, are we going to have rules, expectations, and values within the family? Absolutely. It's really important to establish those boundaries and talk about what those rules and expectations are. However, are we always going to follow the rules? Probably not. And so if we are willing to negotiate on some issues, what does that look like? And when we talk about these dialectical dilemmas, I really encourage you to sit down as a family and start to have discussions. What is the middle path between too loose and too strict? And how can we achieve our goals by also thinking dialectically? So, for example, your adolescent or your young adult has a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner and insists on sleeping over their house. The initial parent response might be, no way, absolutely not. You're not dating until you're married, right? But some of us may have said that before. Now, on the other side, the parent might forbid their child to see their significant other. And what is going to happen when we act on the side of too strict? What might happen is that someone goes and sees their partner anyway. They engage in, the relationship secretively, right? Or they don't tell you about what's going on in their relationship. And so how can we start to look at and go down more of a middle path? Can that person come over for dinner? And maybe stay late for a movie, right? Can they watch the movies with the door closed? Is that something that's acceptable? While also recognizing that at this stage of life, having a sleepover with your partner might not be appropriate. So again, we really want to find that middle path. Another example might be that your young one insists on staying up until midnight, and our initial response might be absolutely not, you're going to bed at 9 p.m., that's final. We can imagine the kind of conflict that creates. Some of us are probably experiencing this currently. And so the way that we might look at that is if their homework is done and they don't really have a problem getting up early, can they go to bed at 10 or 11 p.m.? And if they do have a problem with getting up on time, you would then talk about that as a family. I hear that you want to stay up until midnight, and I know that you really have a difficult time getting up at 7 a.m. So let's work this out. Let's talk about this and find the middle path together. The next dialectical dilemma that we talk about is making light of problem behaviors and making too much of normal adolescent behaviors. This is another big one, which is why we're talking about it. So again, when we're finding the middle path, we want to recognize when a behavior crosses the line, and we want to try to get help for that behavior, and we want to recognize which behaviors are part of normal adolescent or young adult development. And so, for example, making light of problem behaviors or minimizing them when we're addressing behaviors such as substance use, self-harm, or suicidal ideation, some really difficult behaviors, making light of them might look like, well, all teens want to die at some point. I mean, life's hard, right? I hated being a teenager. Or all teenagers use drugs. It's just a phase. And as we know, not only is that invalidating, but if we don't recognize that these experiences are problematic, more difficult and problematic things can happen. And then when we talk about making too much of adolescent behavior, things like being argumentative or refusing to do homework or not being compliant with chores or pushing back against rules, parents, while frustrating, these behaviors are typical. And so what do we do about it? And how as a family can we talk about what are realistic expectations while also recognizing that some of these behaviors might occur? And the last one that we want to talk about is forcing independence versus fostering dependence. And this can be a big one, especially if your young one is living at home. And so again, when we talk about the middle path, we want to give your adolescent guidance, support, rules, and structure to help them figure out how to be responsible with their increased freedom, while also slowly giving them greater amounts of freedom and independence while allowing for an appropriate amount of reliance on others. And sometimes what this can look like, I know for me, the idea was that when I was 18, I was to move out and go to college. That was the expectation. Now, thankfully, I was ready to do that at 18. But as some of us know, and as some of us are experiencing currently, being 18 does not necessarily mean that we are ready or have the skills to live on our own. And so how can we find the middle path between setting an expectation of when a young one does become more independent and possibly leave the house, and also recognizing that they might be 18, 20, or 30 and still need your support. So again, like I said, forcing independence would look like at this age, you're out And fostering dependence would be continuing to rescue your child from problem situations and not holding them accountable from their actions. And oftentimes we do this because we love our young ones, we want them to be safe, and by continuing to foster that dependence and rescuing them, we're not necessarily teaching them or giving them the life skills that they need to live independently. And so what could that look like? And so when we talk about dialectical dilemmas, they're really all over the place and they all impact each other. And so how can we really start to be in the middle of all of these dialectical dilemmas? And what I encourage, like I said, is to sit down as a family and recognize, where are you on the spectrum? Are you forcing them to be independent? Are you fostering dependence? Are you making too much of typical behaviors or making light of problem behaviors? Are you too loose? Are you too strict? As a family, I encourage you to sit down and recognize where you are on the spectrum and then talk about, how do we move forward? What are the expectations and what is the middle path? And remember that in families, the middle path might look like recognizing the parents' experience and feelings as true, and also recognizing the young one's experience and feelings as true, and trying to find the balance in the middle path.